America isn't working, literally. Official statistics show that in February 2015, 1/3 of all working-age Americans were out of employment. That's 93 million people, a record high. And all this in a country which repeatedly claims it has the world's largest economy. At the same time, an organisation called the Urban Institute has reported that American wealth inequality has increased sharply. The main losers are black people and Hispanics, with white Americans owning no less than 12 times the assets of black Americans. Meanwhile, the US dollar has been having a rough ride against Chinese and European currencies. Most Americans also say they experienced a financial shock last year and feel unprepared for a financial emergency now, even though the global recession itself was over 6 years ago. Why do so many Americans feel insecure? How justified is the United States in claiming it has a strong economy? And why, on average, are black Americans so much poorer than white Americans? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. And we began with that record-breaking 93 million out-of-work Americans. That's 1/3 of the entire working-age population of the country. It begs the question, what's gone wrong with the US economy? Here are the views of the American public.
A lot of things. We don't look out for each other. We don't do what we say we're going to do. We make promises we can't keep.
Nothing wrong with the U.S. economy. All of these people are simply not qualified to do these jobs. All these jobs require a somewhat educated or motivated mind to do them. And Americans just aren't up to par. If you look at the education system in America, it's 100% trash.
Nothing's wrong with the U.S. economy. It's just changing and evolving, and a lot of traditional places where there was work, there is not work.
I don't know if the economy has anything wrong with it. I think it's definitely getting better.
Well, in my honest opinion, I feel like the U.S. economy is not really putting money towards educational things or work stuff. They're honestly more concerned about war and other things like ISIS more than they are about making world peace. And they're not really looking as in a whole as, people have, needs to make money,
I have no idea what's wrong with the economy. People run up too much credit, and from there on, the ball just keeps rolling. They have too many debts and can't pay it off.
I mean, we don't make anything. That's obvious, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Like, our economy is transitioning. If we're going to be post-industrial, we have to, we can't just have high-paying jobs be post-industrial. It has to be all aspects of the economy, I guess.
I'm not really sure. Things fluctuate. Things tend to fluctuate. So at one point it can be good, at another point it can be bad.
Greed and competitiveness being misdirected, I feel.
I think the problem with the U.S. economy is the fact that we're not getting as many domestic jobs as there should be, I mean, the stock prices are going up in Wall Street, but, at the same time, too, employment's still low, and that needs to change.
Those are the answers we got from the American public. We asked our experts to analyse what's been going wrong with the economy in America.
In the United States, and actually other Western economies, there's a much higher level of unemployment than is recorded in the unemployment rate. Tens of millions of workers are not in the workforce at all. And a very large portion of that is people who are categorised as discouraged workers. That is, they're unemployed, but they've stopped looking for work because they can't find any, and they've simply dropped out of the workforce altogether. And there's a reason for that in the US and with other Western economies, and that's simply that the economy is not generating sufficient growth to create sufficient new jobs for all workers. And that's been a long-term structural problem, which is getting worse. It may be slightly improving now, but that's a small upturn in a very long-term downtrend, which is really related to the fact that the economies aren't growing enough because there isn't enough investment.
Well, I think the headline figure for unemployment is falling at the minute. That was true of the last figures. But in part, the the unemployment figures fall because increasing numbers of Americans don't bother to seek work anymore. In other words, they've given up trying to find jobs, and that is the effect of causing unemployment to fall. So it's a symptom of an underlying, deeper underlying problems.
A new poll shows that a clear majority of Americans experienced a financial shock last year and feel unprepared for a new financial emergency. Why do so many Americans feel insecure? We put that question to the public.
Because there's so much going on and there's so much uncertainty. It's not really static. There aren't really many gatekeepers to anything. It really makes everything more open to innovation as a result, too.
Not sure.
Really, I did not know Americans feel insecure. I feel like Americans are probably overconfident. When you go to other places, the perception of America, they seem like Americans are overconfident, probably a little arrogant, because they tend to feel like we're the best.
I would just say, yeah, it's clear that the whole economy is shifting, so nobody really can feel secure about what their future is financially, because everybody's seen just certain aspects go away, so it scares them.
Because people don't save, either they can't or they just don't, so they don't have any money. That's why they're insecure.
They don't prepare. They should. You see those people with like doomsday backpacks and stuff, and it seems like a crazy idea, but you do it and it's actually somewhat all right, I guess. So preparation, really.
Most likely because they're terrible at planning their expenses, but also probably having to do with the stronger members of the economy being more greedy than they need to be, whereas profit motive is the highest motive, humanitarianism isn't. So whereas people can, if they wanted to, sacrifice percentages of profit to them, which is percentages, to a family could be eating for a month. People aren't willing to do that.
Because politically speaking, nobody really worries about the voice of the people, such as like, president-related stuff. The government doesn't really worry about our opinions. They think they know it all, like they have their own opinion. And plus, what makes it very unsafe too is NYPD as well.
Yeah, as the world's evolving, there's a lot of uncertainty from commodities, oil prices, to just the workforce changing, an import-export business. So people are unsure what the next change is going to be and where it might come from and how it's going to affect them.
We invited our experts to assess why such a large proportion of Americans feel financially insecure.
There's a great deal of insecurity amongst ordinary Americans, and it's related to two factors. One is that their incomes aren't growing at all rapidly, and for a period were actually falling in real terms. But the other is the high levels of debt that many people already have, for example, from student loans to go through college, and the fear of new debts related to things like medical bills. As you know, in the US, most people have to pay for private medical insurance, or their access to medical care is very limited as a result. And that leads to great insecurity, either about themselves or about their family members, and in relation to their jobs, because many are able to have medical insurance from their firm, but if they lose their job or forced to relocate or something happens to their firm, then that becomes a great new burden on them and a great new threat if anything should go wrong with them or their family in terms of illness or accident. So there's a great deal of insecurity, basically because the very high levels of debt and very low levels of income growth.
Because the basic way in which economic growth operates in the United States these days is that the economy may grow, the amount of goods and services may increase, but people's wages don't increase. Wages in the United States have stagnated since the 1970s. Plus the social security system is very weak. That means people are extremely vulnerable. If anything goes wrong, they have nothing to fall back on. The state won't help them. So people live in a condition of economic insecurity.
According to a new report, white Americans have 12 times the wealth of black Americans. Do the public blame capitalism, racism, or something else? Here's what we found out.
No, I think it's just you're each individual person. It shouldn't be about a certain stereotype or a certain race or one person. It's you, it's yourself, it's how you live and how you treat others. That's how it should be.
Capitalism, probably. Yeah.
And why is that?
Well, there is a handful of people that own everything, and they rule the economy. They have everything.
I would say it's a little bit of both, but mostly towards the capitalism side. Because as I said, the government is investing in wrong things. Nobody's really looking at, we have a lot of homeless people out here on the streets, a lot of uneducated teenagers and Black Americans and all races, you know, and I feel like capitalism has a lot more to do with it than it does racism.
I blame both, and I also blame their own culture. They don't have, like I said before, Asians have a culture that promote hard work. Black culture doesn't have that, not at all.
Both. I think our capitalism, just because it's just get the most you can, it helps to be racist in some ways, and it's built into our form of capitalism. It's just more beneficial for people to continue to be racist.
Racism has a systematic effect and a long-term effect, and that's certainly at play in wealth inequality. If I blame capitalism, but I'm sure that inherent in capitalism will be inequality.
I think it's more of classism now. I don't really think it has nothing to do with race no more. It's probably which class you are that determines how much money you make or opportunities that you get.
Varied answers there from the American public. What are the reasons for the huge wealth gap between American black people and American white people? We asked our experts.
There are many disparities in the US, but perhaps the greatest one of all is the disparity in income and wealth between black and white. The whole history of the United States speaks to that in terms of how we've got to this point. The US economy has been built as the biggest and most vibrant capitalist economy in the world, and yet it was built on a foundation of slavery. Black people didn't come to the United States in the way that the white European settlers did, escaping poverty or tyranny. They were brought as slaves, and that whole history has marked out the US, and the problems of income and wealth inequality are related to that. We see it in all sorts of ways still, in terms of the largely black population who have been striking for better pay in the fast food industry, and we see it very graphically in the treatment of black people in places like Ferguson. And the idea that the US is a post-racist society is a nonsense. Racism, unfortunately, is alive and kicking in the US. The good thing is, though, that some people are kicking back.
Well, I think the two have worked together very closely in the United States ever since the country was first formed. Racism developed partly to justify the slavery that was very profitable, both for American slave owners, but also for example, the British economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. And racism and capitalism have continued to work together in the United States in a very obvious way, in that there's a very profound division between black and white people in the United States. That makes it much harder for the American working class to act as a cohesive and unified force because of these racial divisions.
The US dollar has long been struggling against currencies such as those in China and Europe. Is it right for successive US governments to claim that they have a strong economy? We asked the public.
No. I mean, it's really complex what makes a strong economy. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of good, profitable stuff that's happening right now. But if you're looking at it from an economist standpoint, there's probably all these little factors that come into play that, you know, those of us who are laymen can't really absorb.
Well, the U.S. has a very strong economy. It's just that the U.S. is not in the same position, obviously, financially or politically, we were in the 90s, when we could dictate basically practically anything we wanted. And now we have to consider other points of view.
No, it isn't right. They always want to be on top of things, right? The Americans. So maybe they should be more realistic and say, no, we're not on top. And they have a better economy at this time, and perhaps we can do something about it.
Can't make a problem go away by ignoring it. So if we have an issue, against those other currencies, then we probably should be doing something about it, have policies that are focused towards it.
Absolutely not. In fact, that is exactly what causes financial breakdowns like in 2008. Pretending that you are stronger than you aren't is probably more of a geopolitical military technique, but it doesn't work in economies, because anyone who has an educated mind will see it and say, hey, look, this doesn't add up to any numbers. So it's just speculation.
I don't necessarily think pretending is good. Why should you pretend? You should be honest, but I guess pretending does get you a little far. If somebody's gullible to believe, a perception that you're giving out, then probably it does work, but pretending, I think that's corny.
To what extent is Washington justified in its claims that the American economy is strong? Our experts said this.
The US dollar is currently rising against most major currencies, but if you look at the very long term, the US dollar has been falling, say, since the end of the Second World War. And the reason for that is because there's a structural weakness in the US economy. The US economy has big debts to the rest of the world. It runs a big deficit with the rest of the world. And therefore it needs capital to cover that debt from the rest of the world, and has growing debts. And the reason for that is the US economy is not generating sufficient growth to meet both rising living standards and to pay for its vast military budget, and therefore is obliged to suck in capital from the rest of the world. That causes problems for the rest of the world. In periods of falling US dollar, it makes some other countries less competitive, and it causes dislocation. At the same time, when we have, as now, a rising US dollar, we often have a situation where other countries have capital flight, higher interest rates. We see, for example, falling commodities prices. All those have a big negative effect because of that structural weakness of the US economy.
Well, everything is relative. The US economy is growing more strongly than the European economy at the minute. And one sign of that is actually the dollar has risen quite a lot against the euro recently. So at the minute the US is up and Europe is down. The Chinese economy is also slowing down. So these factors make the US look stronger just by the comparison between different countries. In the longer term, I think it's clear that Europe faces very deep economic difficulties. It's finding it very hard to overcome the crisis that developed around the Eurozone, and I think that will hold Europe back more than the US is held back. But in the longer term, the US's power is declining, particularly relative to China, and the fact that the dollar is strong at the minute doesn't change that.
The US has habitually spent billions of dollars in war and controversial alliances with Arab dictatorships. What message would the American public like to send to their government? We gave them the chance to do just that.
Priorities.
It's just, again, a handful of people that just keep pushing the wrong way and making alliances and not focusing on their own country and the welfare of its own people. I think that's very important. And I think the Americans, they're getting away from that.
I think there's better ways to deal with people who run societies differently than us than just to sort of impose our values on them.
More investment at home.
My message to the U.S. government is the same message that George Washington had in his farewell address, which is to be careful of making alliances with people and, to play fair, do right, and, don't trust them.
Well, other major economies also spend a lot of money on their military, hopefully not on war. We've wasted a lot of money on war, but money spent on our military can be a stabilizing force in the world. So I support military spending as long as we don't go to war needlessly and squander huge quantities of money.
Get it together a little bit. Just don't be so pompous. Come on, like, let's work with each other. Let's not separate each other.
I don't want to answer that question.
Well, I feel as a person we should all make peace together as a unity. That's what we are here for. That's what the USA is. And I feel like instead of us trying to have war, we should try to settle that. And we should all come together and try to help the minority who actually does need help. You know, because we need a government to help us. We can't do it on our own. We need that guidance. And we're lacking the guidance and the communication and fairness. That is what I say, world peace.
Wow. I have a philosophy generally of inclusiveness, so you should be working, on both sides to get everybody to come along, come together and work together for the betterment of everyone.
We asked our experts what message they would like to send to American administrations of all political affiliations.
The US military budget is larger than, I think it's the next 10 military budgets put together. It spends a vast amount of its money on weaponry. And it has a whole set of alliances with unsavoury characters and through to outright dictatorships across the world. In the Middle East, we see it with the alliance with the Saudi regime and Israel. We see it in Africa. We see it with Southeast Asian dictators, and we've seen it in the past in Latin America, and there's still been coups recently in Latin America and interference in Latin America. There's also interference in Western European politics for the US interests. And there's a reason for that, and it relates to the economic problems that we've been discussing. If you need capital constantly from the rest of the world, you can't always guarantee that they're going to give it to you. But if you've got your troops stationed in their country, and if you've toppled the previous president, then it's quite likely that they're more willing to give you the capital, less willing to impose capital controls, and more willing to do what you want. So the relationship between the military and economic weakness is a very firmly entrenched one. That's how the US operates globally.
I don't think the US government would listen very much to me. But I think for the American people, they carry an enormous burden. They've been through this terrible economic crisis where lots and lots of people suffered, they lost their jobs, they lost their homes. But if you look at who's on top in the United States, it's the same bankers, and other rich capitalists who were on top before. So the people who caused the crisis haven't suffered significantly as a result of it. And similarly, the US still tries to determine the fate of other regions. It tries to dominate the Middle East, tries to dominate Asia. And I suppose I'd say to ordinary Americans, you'd be much better off without the kind of economic and financial system that weighs so heavily on you, and you'd be much better off if your government wasn't trying to determine the fate of people all over the world.
American governments of all political persuasions have watched passively on as the US economy persistently lets down its citizens. Yet the politicians continue to spend fortunes on international military initiatives while allowing the greatest of inequalities and poverty to persist in their own land. Whatever they may say, the evidence leads many to a stark conclusion. America is eager to wage war abroad, but it hasn't even begun to try to wage war on its economic poverty at home.